Mercedes had the worst weekend of the season in Singapore. George Russell was hamstrung by issues early on in the weekend, and Lewis Hamilton had his worst drive in recent memory. The two Mercedes men were clearly frustrated and decided to take that frustration out on other drivers, with Hamilton going as far as accusing one Ferrari driver of trying a move Max Verstappen made on him last year. What went wrong for Mercedes in Singapore, and what accusations have the drivers been making? Let's check it out. George Russell reckons Mercedes could have claimed their first victory of the 2022 F1 season on merit at the Singapore Grand Prix, had he and his team executed a cleaner weekend. Russell suffered a surprise Q2 exit at the Marina Bay Street circuit as brake issues scuppered his efforts, with Mercedes electing to turn his P11 grid spot into a pit lane start by fitting a host of new power unit elements. The team decided to make a strategic move and make a power unit change in Singapore at relatively little cost, giving him fresh elements for the remainder of the season. Starting P11 anyway, the team obviously thought that this was the best chance they would get before the end of the season to make the move. Russell took an ICU, Turbo, MGU-H, MGU-K, Control Electronics and Energy Store, all of which generate penalties. He's also taken a new exhaust that is within his allocation. Immediately after qualifying, he didn't know what the cause was, although later it emerged that it was related to the brakes. I had a recurring issue that we faced in FP1, where I kind of felt every time I got to the corner, I was kind of like picking up the throttle, he said. And the car was totally pushing on. I think we see this issue on the data, but it got progressively worse as the qualifying continued, so I couldn't get around any of the slow speed corners. It was literally like someone was trying to push me from behind. So that was a real shame. Working his way up the order from the back of the field, Russell was the first driver to make the switch from intermediates to slicks as the wet-dry race developed. It was clear to everyone watching, though, that he had made the move too early, spending most of his outlap drifting around the Marina Bay circuit. He'd been stuck behind Valtteri Bottas for a while when they made the move, a real gamble to try and get him up the order. The fact that the physical and virtual safety car had an almost constant present for the rest of the race didn't help Russell. When he could get his slick tyres up to temp, they weren't too bad, but as soon as he had to slow again, they were far worse than the old intermediates every other car was on. Any hopes of a point finish were dashed when he clashed with Haas driver Mick Schumacher and picked up a puncture. After crossing the line as the final finisher in 14th, with the fastest lap to his name, Russell said, "We were in no man's land, to be honest. Potentially, it was worth switching to slicks because at the restart we were flying. I overtook 3 people on one lap after the safety car. Then I had the tangle with Mick. I don't really know what happened there. I felt like I left him plenty of space. We would have probably finished inside the points because we were flying and got the fastest lap at the end by almost 2 seconds. The stewards decided that there was no action necessary, but Mick Schumacher clearly thought that George was to blame for the coming together. I think we all know George has quite a bit of a faster car under his feet," Schumacher told the media after the race. "In my view, I did signal my intentions of not wanting him to go by, because I felt like the conditions were too wet to try and overtake. I felt like I was on the dry line. He was trying to come back to the dry line, but obviously that was taken by my car. And then we both had a puncture, or at least I had a puncture. If finishing outside of the top 5 for the first time this season wasn't bad enough for George, he also managed to pick up a fine from the FIA. Russell's weekend went from bad to worse as he was caught speeding in the pit lane on his way to the track. The FIA took the immediate decision to hand Mercedes a fine for €100 just minutes before the start of the race. He exceeded the pit lane speed limit, which was set at 60 km an hour for the event, by 0.6 km an hour. With Russell having a first bad weekend of the season, surely Mercedes could rely on their 7-time world champion to bring home some points to help them fight Ferrari for second in the constructors. Hamilton has built a reputation during his career of never making mistakes on race day. In Singapore, though, he made 2 huge errors that cost him a massive points haul. It was an eventful day for Hamilton, who started P3 but was immediately passed by Carlos Sainz and spent the majority of his race stuck behind the Ferrari driver. That was until lap 33, when he went for an overtake at turn 7, only to lock up and crash nose first into the Tech Pro barrier. He was able to reverse and rejoin the track, but did so behind Lando Norris, who was defending P5 from Max Verstappen. Hamilton emerged back onto the track just ahead of Verstappen. Hamilton then had to pit to replace his damaged front wing, which dropped him further down the grid to P9 behind Sebastian Vettel. The Briton was then engaged in a battle for position with two other world champions as he fought Vettel and Verstappen, the latter of whom had also locked up and sunk down the order. The three drivers were running Vettel, Hamilton, Verstappen until Hamilton again locked up on the wet part of the track at turn 8. He saved himself from hitting the barriers that time but lost his place to the Red Bull man. After finishing P9, Hamilton apologised to his team following the mistake, which ended his hopes of a podium finish. "I don't think so," Hamilton replied when asked if he thought a podium would have been on had he managed to pass Sainz. "Potentially we could have undercut him, but it was a battle of who got on the slicks first, and it would have been slice and dice. I was hoping for that, and that's what I was working towards. But then it went all out the freaking window when I locked up. So my apologies to the team, but we live and we learn. I'll recover." It was a surprise to hear Hamilton say he didn't think he could have secured a podium after complaining at how much Sainz had been holding him up all race. During a virtual safety car, the Mercedes man nearly managed to overtake Sainz as the two of them were gambling on when the lights would go green and allow racing again. As the pair jostled for the best possible starting position when the virtual safety car was brought back in, Hamilton felt as though the Spaniard had braked a little too sharply. "He just brake tested me," he said on the radio. It was Verstappen who last brake checked the Brit in the penultimate race of 2021. That incident was definitely a brake check. This one was definitely not though, and it was a crazy accusation for Hamilton to make about Carlos Sainz. Like Russell, Hamilton's misery in Singapore wasn't limited to the race. Hamilton has been very outspoken against the FIA trying to ban drivers for wearing jewellery during races. The ban came in for safety purposes, but Hamilton wasn't interested in following the new rule and got caught out in Singapore. Lewis Hamilton was allowed to keep wearing his nose stud at the Singapore Grand Prix for medical reasons, but his team was fined €25,000 on Sunday for failing to notify stewards. Mercedes was slapped with the penalty by Formula One's governing body, the FIA, for submitting a self-scrutineering form that said the British driver had removed all jewellery and piercings in line with regulations. In recent events, Hamilton had removed the piercing prior to the competition. The team assumed, without inquiring of Hamilton, that he'd followed or would follow the same procedure for this event, said the FIA stewards in their ruling. Seven-time world champion Hamilton told reporters he was wearing the stud again on the advice of doctors after suffering from an infection when he removed it. The Singapore weekend was a definite low point for Mercedes this season, probably the worst since the dawn of the turbo hybrid era. Despite this, Toto Wolff has learned to be humble this season and said the team would take the lessons they can from the weekend and move on. Toto Wolff said, "This season has given us several tough lessons, and Sunday was another one. We started from opposite ends of the grid with our two cars, but we couldn't capitalize on the car's race pace with either of them when it came to an end result. The biggest frustration is that we couldn't build on the signs of competitive performance we saw in FP2 and in qualifying." With Ferrari securing a double podium, Mercedes' hopes of clinching second in the Constructors' Championship is now a steep climb as it trails the Scuderia by 67 points. But refusing to give in, Wolff said, "The only thing to do is to collect ourselves and throw our energy into the next race in Suzuka to rebuild momentum." What do you think of the accusations George Russell and Lewis Hamilton made of their fellow drivers during the race? Do you think both need to stop moaning about other cars racing them? Or are they in the right to call out their competitors? Let us know what you think in the comments down below, and until next time, drive safe and bye for now.